You're looking at images of federal convoys rolling through city streets, protesters clashing with armed officers. Now, you might think this is a border town, but it's not. It's Minneapolis, Minnesota, a really unlikely stage for a huge national immigration drama. And what's happening here? Well, it's more than just policy. It's a performance, a spectacle with some very, very real consequences.
And that brings us to the central puzzle of this whole thing. I mean, think about it. The major immigration hubs are in places like California, Texas, and Florida. So why on earth send thousands of federal agents here to the Midwest? It doesn't seem to make any tactical sense.
And when you look at the actual numbers, it gets even weirder. Minnesota is home to less than 2% of the entire nation's undocumented population. So if the goal here is pure enforcement, the resources are in completely the wrong place. But here's the thing. This probably isn't a strategic flaw. It's a clue.
That clue tells us that to understand the why of all this, we can't be looking at policy papers or immigration stats. The logic isn't hidden in some Washington, D.C. bureaucracy. No, it's somewhere else entirely.
The answer, and believe me, I know how this sounds, is found in professional wrestling. Now you gotta stick with me on this, because the rule book that explains all the chaos you're seeing in Minnesota, it isn't about law and order. It's about spectacle and drama.
So in this first part, we're going to break down this core idea. We're going to explore how the administration's strategy starts to look a whole lot less like governing and a lot more like a carefully staged wrestling match.
Okay, so the key to understanding all of this is a word from the wrestling world, Kayfabe. It's basically this unwritten agreement between the performers and the audience to pretend the show is real. Everybody knows it's staged, right? But they all agree to suspend their disbelief so they can get invested in the story, the characters, and the fight.
And this quote from Jason Myles just hits the nail on the head. It shows exactly how this applies to politics. When you're operating with the logic of Kayfabe, you're not actually trying to solve a problem like immigration. You're trying to turn it into the biggest, loudest, most dramatic show you possibly can.
So here's the crucial point. The objective totally changes. It's not about passing laws or securing borders. It's about generating heat. You know, that intense, raw, emotional energy you get from a crowd. It's all about creating villains and heroes and getting your base absolutely fired up.
So let's look at the playbook for this. In wrestling, the heel, that's the bad guy, uses what's called a provocation loop. First, they deliberately break the rules to make the crowd furious. Then, they use that fury to justify an even bigger fight. And finally, the heel frames that fight as them taking on a corrupt system. They actually become an anti-hero fighting for the people, even though they're the ones who created the chaos in the first place. So let's see how this political theater actually plays out on the streets. Because while the strategy might feel like a performance, the consequences are dangerously real. This is where Kayfabe creates what is essentially a human powder keg.
On one side of this, you have a huge shift in protest tactics. Activism used to be focused on quiet, after-the-fact legal support, helping people after an arrest. But now it has morphed into these direct, on-the-street confrontations. Groups calling themselves Ice Watch are all about obstruction, blowing whistles, blocking vehicles, and they're often doing it to create viral moments for social media. And on the other side, you've got the federal agents themselves. Get this. Veteran officers have described this new wave of recruits sent to Minneapolis as skittish and ideological. A lot of them are volunteers just chasing overtime. And according to sources on the inside, they're being fed these threat briefings that basically prime them to see American citizens as insurgents.
So what happens when you mix these two things? You get this paranoid, South Minneapolis is Baghdad mindset from federal agents crashing right into confrontational protesters who are actively trying to provoke a reaction. In this kind of tinderbox environment, tragedy isn't just possible, it becomes a statistical certainty.
And that brings us to what happens when that tragedy finally strikes. In the world of political wrestling, a real human crisis becomes just another tool for the audience, letting everyone choose the reality that they prefer.
Let's use the tragic shooting of Renee Good as our case study here. A protester is killed by a federal agent. Now, in a normal world, this would be a moment for a serious investigation, for mourning. But in the world of Kayfabe, it becomes something else entirely. The event basically becomes a Rorschach test. For one audience, the story is all about radical leftists obstructing federal officers, with people claiming she tried to run them over. For the other audience, icy agents are like a modern Gestapo, and any kind of resistance is justified self-defense. Both sides grab onto little bits of truth to build a story that fits perfectly with their worldview.
And the real tragedy here is that in both of these competing stories, the actual human being, Renee Good, she just disappears. Her life, her story, her loss, it's all completely erased. She just becomes a prop, a symbol to score points in a political game.
So, of course, this forces us to ask, well, what really happened? What is the objective truth of the situation? We want to find the facts, right? The facts that will settle the debate once and for all.
But see, in Kayfabe, you're asking the wrong question. The ambiguity, the confusion, the fact that both sides can claim they're right, that isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system. The point isn't to resolve the conflict. The point is to keep the conflict going, because that's what keeps the audience engaged.
And that leads us to the final, and maybe the most uncomfortable part of this whole dynamic, the role of the audience. Because, a show can't exist if there's no one there to watch it.
This table does a great job of explaining why just fact-checking this kind of politics never really works. From a traditional point of view, sending agents to Minnesota is just poor strategy. But from a Kayfabe view, it's a great stage. The facts, like that less than 2% statistic, they don't matter because the goal isn't enforcement. It's performing a ritual of law and order for an audience that wants to see it.
Look, when the real reasons for things, the decisions in D.C., the complicated history of policy, are too confusing or, frankly, too boring, people look for simpler explanations. They turn to myth. You might even hear some bizarre theories, like a demonic portal opening over the city, because, for some people, a supernatural story can actually feel more satisfying than a complex political one.
So, the big question is, how do we break this spell? How do we move past being just passive spectators in what's become a really dangerous political performance?
Ultimately, every show needs an audience to survive. The power of Kayfabe depends entirely on our willingness to suspend our disbelief and just cheer for our side. So the final question I want to leave you with is this. What happens when we, the audience, decide to stop watching the spectacle and make a conscious choice to start seeing the real human beings who are caught in the middle of it all?